welcome to our first episode of Healthy Politics, where we'll discuss the eternal intersection of healthcare in the United States and American politics. My name is Nick Carls. I'm a benefits attorney and the director of employee benefits compliance at Holmes Murphy. And with me is my esteemed co-host, Dan Bishop, former president of Holmes Murphy and our longtime healthcare strategist extraordinaire. And he has written more than one book on this. I've pointed this out to him before. I have it dog-eared. I'm studying up. And then say, hey, Dan, I'll let you get a word in right away.
Good to see you, Nick. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. We're going to start the series with a little discussion about how we got to where we are today and what we know about the current state of the political discussions and positions surrounding healthcare. But before we get into that, one of the things I want to point out is a little detail, and that is I have no idea what Dan's politics are, and he has no idea what my politics are either. We've talked a decent number of times. We've talked about healthcare and politics, but I have no idea what you are. And I think for at least the length of this series, we keep it that way. How do you feel about that?
I like that. And you know, my definition of politics in working through this is politics is where really law and people and money come together. And if something is the intersection of those three things, it's political. So there we are.
I was about to ask you, why is a discussion of healthcare political, right? And I think you just answered that question, right?
Yeah, you know, I think that's part of it, and the other part of it is, you know, if you look at the health insurance ecosystem, and I'll use the term health insurance. How do people get their insurance? You know, you've got a few more people in this country get their insurance through their employer than get it through government sources. We're not at 50-50 yet, but it is trending that way. And so the federal government is a major purchaser of healthcare services, and the employer-sponsored health insurance, where we spend our time, lives in that same ecosystem. So every decision the federal government makes regarding healthcare has an impact on our clients and the people that work for our clients.
And what I think is interesting is when we start talking about this stuff and we're talking to clients, when we're talking to our friends out there about this stuff, you know, we're watching the news and you hear about that massive bill that some family got, right? And no one fully understands the mechanics behind that bill. It's all kind of magical, right? Like, how did this happen? How did we get here? And you and I spend probably way too much time. Actually, it's probably a good thing we spend as much time as we do learning about how we got there, right? But whether it's because you know they were on Medicaid and they got kicked off, right? So we're talking about a government-run program there, or they have employer-sponsored coverage, but they just didn't understand how their employer's plan operated. It's complex stuff, and so whenever we start talking about the politics behind healthcare, it's just interesting to me because we just get little sound bites that the public generally understands, and beyond that, no one has a clue just how dense this stuff is. I mean, again. How many books have you written on this topic?
2. and you know, you think about it. On one side of the political equation for benefits is what gets covered, what doesn't get covered, and how it gets covered, and the rules and regulations on that. And the other side of it is what it costs. And many of our clients will understand, but some it may be news to them. In employer-sponsored insurance on a national average basis, our clients pay about 2.5 times what Medicare pays for the same hospital services. So every time there's a constriction in a federal budget on how much Medicare or Medicaid can pay, that puts economic pressure on our clients. And it is a direct pass-through system that we're dealing with. So it's the design of benefits that are influenced by politics, and it's the cost of health insurance, both.
So for everyone that's listening in right now, that's watching this, anytime that you hear a politician, whether it's for U.S. House, Senate, the presidency, whatever, whenever they talk about controlling costs for Medicare eligible or Medicare entitled individuals, like if we're going to lower those costs, just know that when Dan and I hear that, we see this seesaw, right? We see go, okay, so the Medicare is going to go down. That means employer-sponsored coverage is going to go up because they're going to get paid one way or another. The providers, the insurers, whatever, they're going to recoup their costs. It's not like it magically, they'll be like, oh, we'll just make less money, right?
Yeah, and one thing that people may not also understand is when the federal government starts to look at how to save money. I mean, we have a budget situation that is as bad as it's ever been in our history as a country in terms of the amount of debt we have as a percentage of GDP. We're equal to where we were in the middle of World War II right now. And it's forecast to go nothing but up. The number one expense for the United States federal government is healthcare. It is the number one expense. So when they look to find a way to try to get a budget a little bit more in line, the first place they look is healthcare. The Congressional Budget Office, about every 2 years, will release some information and ideas on how to try to reduce the federal deficit. Well, fully one third, and the first one third of the ideas in their last publication were all healthcare related and would all shift cost to our clients in the end.
So something that you talked about, it was probably a couple of weeks ago now, you and I were talking about it, and I like to think of myself as an ACA guru, right? I came up in the ACA. I've lived and breathed it for the last decade or whatever. But you were explaining to me the intersection of student loans and the funding for the Affordable Care Act. So this is, again, kind of setting the basis for everyone on how this all works. Can you explain that to me one more time?
Yeah, so President Biden has been actively trying to forgive student loans. I think everybody's aware of that desire that he has and moves that he's made. So how does the federal government have the ability to do that or not do it? The question is constitutionality of that. But control over student loans actually came as part of the Affordable Care Act. The reconciliation of the Affordable Care Act was really my term, the governmentization of student loans. So it is a very wide path that healthcare goes, and sometimes healthcare legislation goes outside of even healthcare. I think the biggest thing when you mention the ACA is when people and voters in past elections would have been thinking about healthcare reform and federal government, a candidate, whether that's going all the way back to President Clinton, because healthcare reform was a big part of his campaign. President Obama, it was his primary piece, was his. Bernie Sanders, as he was running, was all about healthcare reform. When they were talking about healthcare reform, they were talking about health insurance. The Affordable Care Act was health insurance and student loans, but it wasn't really health care, what you get covered, what you don't. There's a little bit of that in there. The vast majority of it was that. My sense is now, when in this election cycle, when voters and politicians are having a discussion around health care, it's actually not health insurance. It's not healthcare reform as the ACA would do it. To me, it's actually healthcare services. It's Roe v. Wade versus the Dobbs decision and a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy or not. And what is the federal government role? These are things that when I was writing books about healthcare reform, it was not about healthcare. It was about health insurance and who could get coverage and how would they get it. In this world, my view is voters are more concerned around these types of rights that a person has or doesn't have, and whether the federal government controls it or state controls it, or a vaccine mandate and those kinds. Really, healthcare services, I think, for at least this election cycle, have supplanted healthcare reform defined as health insurance. And in my view, kind of, what's your take really around all that's happened in this evolution since the ACA?
Well, so I mean, what you said is perfect. I think we're going from how do we pay for it, right? So we're using student loans to help fund it. We're doing all sorts of things about medical loss ratio with insurance to make sure that insurers aren't making too much money. Again, it's all about the dollars and cents. And we don't hear a lot of discussion anymore about repealing the Affordable Care Act, right? That's pretty much gone at this point. The repeal, replace, that's all gone away. And so I actually completely agree with you. We got to find some more divisive topics for the next episode so you and I can really get into that heated thing here. Because I look at it now, I'm like, no, it's treatment for gender dysphoria, right? It's Roe v. Wade, the abortion conversation. It is things like mental health parity. So again, the treatment, the actual conditions, and making sure that those things are treated. Now, that's what I've heard up until now. What I think is really interesting is so far, there hasn't been a robust conversation around healthcare, whether it's the paying for it or what's being covered, right? It's not really jumped to the forefront. I mean, right now, the conversations we're seeing around politics are almost ancillary to a lot of this stuff, right? And so I think it'll be extremely interesting to see over the next, how many months out are we now? 4 months, thereabouts?
Five. Yep.
Over the next 5 months, how that evolves, how that changes, if we see that greater push to bring some of those topics, that was just mentioning, whether it's a mental health parity, Roe v. Wade thing, if that starts to push its way up, or if there's some other thing that comes up. One of the things you and I were discussing before we started recording here was, the Chevron, the deference to the agencies that was part of Chevron, right? That Supreme Court decision from the 80s. We had a couple of Supreme Court cases that were just decided where we don't really have the Chevron deference anymore, right? And so a lot of the agency action is going to be called into question. If we start seeing that happen left and right from special interest groups, and it's happening with different things that are popular with the public, I think we could have some emerging topics there. It all depends on how fast it happens, though, right? When are those lawsuits filed?
Yeah. So Nick, when you mentioned the Chevron decision in terms of that, for our listeners who aren't familiar, where are you going with that?
You mean that the people listening in on this don't have a clue what I'm talking about right now? As I get into Supreme Court precedent and all that. Back in the 80s, the Supreme Court said basically, when Congress is silent on something, or it's ambiguous or it's unclear, then we're going to defer to the agencies to interpret it and to implement and enforce those things that are unclear or left a little vague. And so for a long time now, 30 some years, we've been working off of that, and the agencies have been working off of that. We have this humongous sphere of rules and regulations that aren't in the statute. It's made up by the agencies, and that's certainly true when we look at the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. When we're looking at some of the implementation of mental health parity, we're seeing it again, right? And so when we think about that, if those things can now be challenged, I think they will be challenged, right? Any agency action that rubs a special interest group the wrong way, I think they're going to challenge it and say they went outside of their statutory authority on this one.
And so do you feel this is going to create potentially even more complexity for our clients?
A lot more complexity. We're going to really be residing in that gray area. And then on top of that, is kind of tied in with our healthy politics series here. I think we're going to see a number of politicians pressed on, what is your position on this current litigation? I mean, I think for a lot of Democrats, hey, let's just go there. For a lot of Democrats, I think it'll be a pretty easy discussion because they get to say, we believe in the agencies, the regulations they're putting out. They're generally more in favor of that kind of stuff. For the Republicans, it could get interesting if popular provisions like mental health parity, generally it's very popular. But if you have a couple of groups saying, wait, I don't like what this is doing, and they start challenging the agency rules and actions, some of them are going to be in a tough spot to say, no, I support pulling back the agency overreach, except for in this one small area, right?
So is your sense in that, if I kind of take and say in general, the two parties, if you look at health related issues, for the most part, Democratic Party has been in favor of more centralized federal consistency, whether that's with Medicaid expansion or the Dobbs decision, Roe v. Wade. The Democratic Party is typically, hey, we want the whole country to look like this. Republican Party is typically states' rights and more kind of choice of, hey, who implements this or not. So you've got that. And then regarding agency decisions, that come through in this, really viewing that the same way. The Democratic Party more in the, hey, we like what the agencies are doing. Republican Party more stuff in the, oh, this may be something popular that goes away, so maybe vulnerable for the Republican side. Is that your view?
That is what I'm seeing right now. If I'm looking into the crystal ball, that's kind of the way that I'm looking at it. And I do agree with that initial part that you're talking about there, where when we look at a lot of the challenges that we have to risk of preemption, oh man, I better watch my time here because the risk of preemption, that's a deep well, right? But it is one of those things where generally states can regulate self-insured health plans. But we've seen a number of states coming out with laws that are pushing the boundaries, especially targeting PBMs. And a lot of those states have a conservative executive, so they have conservative governor, legislature, what have you. And so, yeah, in those situations, those states are saying we want to take control of this. We don't think the federal government's doing a good enough job. It's interesting stuff.
Well, I think we're about at time for today. In our next discussion, maybe it makes sense we go into what do we really believe the Biden platform may be, what do we think the Trump platform may be, and what implications will those things have on our clients and who may win. Anything from the first debate that you think is relevant in this discussion?
Only that when you and I first started talking about this series and you were laying out kind of their positions, you wrote it down and it was basically exactly what you would think, right? It's Biden basically going with protecting the Affordable Care Act, Trump being largely silent on it, right? I like your idea of delving more into what we have from Biden, what we have from Trump, and even maybe some of the key Senate or House races. Because in about 3 weeks when we talk again, I think that that'll start to heat up a little bit more, and we'll know a little bit more about their positions, especially as some of the candidates have to start kind of taking those harder stances. For those of you listening, it doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. If anything we talked about today was interesting to you, you want to discuss it some more, if you have some questions, feel free to reach out to your Holmes and Murphy representative. They know to get in touch with us. And Dan and I love talking about this stuff. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Bye-bye.